This session to go ahead and we're going to keep our presentations to an hour to allow half an hour for the Q&A. So we'll be ending promptly at 12:30. Thank you.
That's very good.
Could I ask you a favor? My balance is bad because I'm recovering from a... could you get me a headset? Sure. Thank you very much.
Welcome again. Welcome again to the to this last session of the conference, and the second session for today. The second session organized by the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. In the first session today, we addressed the transition from authoritarianism to democracy. Now that we have ensured that the transition has been successfully done, now let's look at how to consolidate transition. What does it take to consolidate transition? Because the outcomes of democracy and the future of the success of any democratic process will depend on how consolidated the process is. To address consolidation of democracy, we have three eminent speakers who will address different aspects and different experiences in consolidating democracy. In order, we will listen to Stephan, David Stark, and Paul Salem. Stephan will talk about democratic consolidation in Muslim-majority countries, reflections on Indonesia, Turkey, and Tunisia. Probably Stephan does not need presentation. However, just to remind the audience here, Stephan, one of the most prominent political scientists, is a founder and director of the Center for the Study of Democracy, Tolerance, and Religion at the School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, our School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. In fact, tries to follow the steps of SIPA, of which the president of the university was the dean. Stephan is professor of government at Columbia. He was professor of government at the University of Oxford. He received numerous honors, but let me emphasize in particular the book he wrote with Juan Linz on problems of democratic transition and consolidation in Southern Europe, South America, and post-communist Europe. And he recently published, with a conclusion from the prominent academic and former president of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a book on democracies in danger. So, Al, what has happened in Indonesia, Turkey, and Tunisia?
It's a great pleasure being here. Really historic time for any of us interested in these types of issues, and great to be here. A cautionary word about democratic consolidation. Even if a non-democratic regime is overthrown and there is general agreement on the desirability of democracy and even a tentative democratic transition, democracy is less likely to be consolidated if there are deep, unresolved differences in the polity about fundamental constitutional issues, such as a broadly accepted relationship between the state, religion, and society. I'll focus on just this aspect of the possible democratic consolidation. There are 4 annual publications that rank countries in a democracy scale. Polity 4 by Ted Gore, Freedom House, the newly ranking one produced by my former employer, the British weekly The Economist, and a German publication. Not one of these 4 publications has ever ranked any Arab country as a democracy for 35 years. Now, I'm fairly confident that the next ranking, Tunisia will be ranked as a democracy. So that's important in itself. And of course, Egypt has a possibility too, but I know less about it. But I'll put it in comparative frame of reference. Many Americans, due to their focus on oil and Israel, tend to conflate Arab with Muslim and create a dangerous fallacy. No Arab country is a democracy at the moment. All Arab countries are Muslim, so the fallacious conclusion, no Muslim countries are democracies. But the same 4 publications judged that for the last 8 years, every single one of the last 8 years, that the most populous Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, is the highest ranked democracy of the 9 countries in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This includes Catholic Philippines, Buddhist Thailand, Confucian Singapore. The same 4 ranking associations also classify Turkey, Senegal, Mali, and Albania as democracies. I'm just using that as a shorthand. I visited all of them except for Mali, and I think that these are reasonably credible comparative rankings. These 5 Muslim-majority countries together have a population of over 300 million people. India, 2 years before independence, was, of course, the largest Muslim country in the world. It's now only the 3rd largest, following Indonesia and Pakistan. But it has 161 million Muslims. And with Yogendra Yadav, Juan Linz and I just finished a book called Crafting State Nations, India and Other Multinational Democracies. But among other things, because of Yogendra Yadav, we were able to do a huge poll of 36,000, census-based, maybe one of the largest ever given in social science. The findings were amazing. The greater the intensity of religious practice, the greater the support for democracy. We replicated this for Indonesia. Roughly, the greater the intensity of religious practice for Hindus, the greater the support for democracy. Exact same finding for Muslims, same findings for Sikhs, same findings for Christians. So the tendency, the greater the intensity of religious practice, the greater the support for democracy. So I think let's put India in our group of strong Muslim populations that have contributed, that are in democracies. Now, if we count India, we have 460 million Muslims living in non-Western democracies. That's really something to think about. Now, neither Robert Dahl, Juan Linz, or Aaron Leipart use the word secularism in their prize-winning works on democracy. None of them use it. But if we must use the word, and I do not like it, we have to de-essentialize it, just as we've de-essentialized modernity into multiple modernities. And I suggest that we de-essentialize secularism, if we have to use the word, and I find it very particularly unuseful word in a Muslim country, because it almost always carries a negative connotation. And if you then link it that you need secularism for democracy and it carries a negative connotation, you're starting with a lot of baggage you simply don't need. So I will speak of multiple secularisms here with that caveat, that ideally I would not like to use the word. Now, I'll use something like twin tolerations because you need enough freedom of democracy to carry out its essential functions from religion. So that's part of what I call the twin tolerations. But you also, to a greater extent than in hard secularism, you need tolerance for religious actors to carry out, to be active in civil society and also active in political society, which you often don't get in a really hard secularism version of it. Of the entire 460 million Muslims in the non-Western democracies, only Turkey is close to the 1905 French style of religiously hostile secularism. Indeed, of the 27 countries that are in the European Union, no one's close to French system of starting in 1905 with a religiously hostile secularism. It's no longer that religiously hostile because de Gaulle changed it, but at least analytically it came from that. With the exception of Turkey, the other 380 million Muslims are in a radically different form of relationship, how they arrived at the twin tolerations. They have a form of what I call the twin tolerations. They've arrived at it in very different ways. They're religiously friendly, but they're democratically friendly. And they don't see any tension in it. Partly because they don't use hardly any of them use the word secularism. Now, many of you are interested in the Turkish AK party, and you should be, because it represents the twin tolerations, but you should be aware that it's in a context, constant context, with an aggressive laicite from Ataturk, supported by the military. The current constitution, 1982 constitution, the upper assembly, the chamber, only had 5 people. Those are the only 5 people in Turkey with 4 stars on their shoulder. They selected every single person in the lower house, and that is the Constitution is a religiously hostile constitution, or a controlling one. Now, some of the things, just very quickly, to understand the Ataturk legacy right now, why Turkey isn't a full model if we're interested in democracy, because it's still struggling over consolidations. 3 military coups since 1960. All of them, most of them having a strong relationship to religion, trying to control it. But some of the things that happen right now, even the AK party has not reversed the Ataturk policy that every single Friday prayer is written by a Ministry of Affairs, and it's the same prayer that must be recited in every single mosque in the country. They have at least 2 microphones in every one that are picking up, and if anyone violates, even by 2 sentences, they're fired the next day. 100% of people who are authorized to read a prayer in Turkey are state employees. And when you violate this, then you can't do it. Other types of things, even under AK, a Muslim woman, very modernist, had a job in PR in Texas, impeccably dressed, happened to wear a headscarf, elected to the parliament. She was what the British would call barracked. They screamed and screamed and screamed, the traditional party, and she never said one word. So she never said a word, even though she was elected in parliament, because there's still this tension, and they kept saying, Iran, Iran, Iran. Get out of here, we're not Tehran. No graduate from a religious training, with a religious training degree is allowed entry into a state university. 50% of the women wear headscarves. But if you wear a headscarf, you can't go in, you can't be employed by public service. And even if you're the president's wife, no military will attend any public ceremony. So President Gül almost has to have 2 public ceremonies for everything he does. So it's still there. Now, many observers think that the Turkish model is the only way to reconcile Islam and democracy. It's not. Indonesia and every other democracy with a Muslim majority has an extremely difficult and more democratically friendly version that I call respect all. Respect all, finance all, construct policy with all. By respect all, I simply mean that when I took a look at how many West European and US religious compulsory holidays where you paid people to have a day off, it's over 90. Now what's interesting is that of those 90, 0 are for any non-Christian religion. What does the respect all model that's followed by all of these countries, with the exception of Turkey, do? In Indonesia, there are 6 holidays for Muslims. 5 minutes. 6 holidays for Muslims, but there are 5 for other religions, 2 for Hindus, one for Catholic, one for Protestants, one for Confucians, one for Buddhists. The respect all in India, there are twice as many holidays for minority religions as there are for the majority religion. In Senegal, even though the Catholics are only now 5% of the population, 40% of the paid compulsory holidays are for them, and the government pays for Catholics to take a pilgrimage to Rome, just as the even the BJP in India had to continue paying for the Muslims in India to take the Hajj. So it's a very, very different. I don't have time to go into it, but I could have gone into. They give financial. All of these countries give financial support to all the religions in the country, every single one of them, and every single one of them is involved with a fair amount of policy cooperation. That, for example, the whole question of how you could campaign against female genital mutilation in Senegal. Obviously, the laïcité state comes from the French tradition, but they say it's laïcité well understood and well practiced. So the only one they use it, meaning not French, is very Senegalese. They said they understood that they could not really go into the rural areas on a campaign against anti-female genital mutilation unless they could give some cooperation with the Sufis. They asked the Sufis to do a Quranic study of what is the Quranic legitimation for anti-female for genital mutilation, and the report was 43-page report that there's absolutely none. It's not in the Quran, and it's not in the habits of the Prophet's companions. So it's not a hadith. Then they said, given that, it's a moral obligation to campaign against it. So they campaigned together, and it was a dramatic decrease in the incidence of that. So that's the type of policy cooperation we can have. Now, let me skip to Tunisia. Many things involved in a transition are involved in a transition, but nothing happening in Tunisia that might hurt consolidation has happened so far. I think there are some things that can hurt consolidation that happen here, but I'm just going to focus on Tunisia. Now, so the biggest thing that most people feel is the tension, potential tension, between Al-Nahda, which some people see, militant laïcité people see as fundamentalist, and militant Al-Nahda people see the secularists as fundamentalists. So there's a fear that both sides are a danger to the other, and that's the biggest problem. Many things that could be a problem aren't. If you have to have a dictatorship, a party dictatorship headed by, backed by the Secret Service is much better than a military dictatorship, because when you get rid of the party dictatorship, it's possible that you don't really have a whole hierarchical structure of people behind it, like the 18 generals on the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces that were there and are still the Supreme Command of this country at the moment. You have nothing like that. You also, most people talked of more because you didn't have a major question. The military hadn't said that there'll be a presidential election. So it was totally open whether it's going to be a parliamentary election or a presidential election. Overwhelming choice was for a parliamentary election. So I think it could be as early as July 24th, it may be 2 months later, but there'll be an election for a constituent assembly, and because there's no presidential election, all the people interested in political parties and in power are going in to compete in that. Whereas here, many of the major actors are running for the presidency and are not involved in power building. Okay, when I talk with, those are the positive things. How are things transcending, getting beyond this terrible conflict, potential conflict? One is Al-Nahda, who had 30,000 people in jail between 1990 and 1995, which is vastly a higher percentage than he had here, if you just put up the ratios of population. Al-Nahda realizes that it has made a number of, I think, credible guarantees that it will go forward. They have absolutely signed an agreement. They say they want to participate in normal politics. They've signed an agreement with 4 parties that they will do nothing to change the family code, which is by far the most progressive in the Arab world and probably in the Muslim world. Abortion's legal. Women can initiate divorce. There's a whole range of things that are just there, and it's really special. They say that we're not going to challenge that at all, and they've signed that. They've also signed an agreement that surprised people, and Tunisia has accepted the following. Unlike Egypt, where there will be a presidential election, that there will be a parliamentary election. That there will be a parliamentary election first, and it'll be a 100% PR, because they absolutely understood that if you had majority elections, it would privilege the old party. It's 100% PR. 100% closed list, 100% closed, and here's the joker, not joker, but the fascinating thing. 50%, every other candidate is a woman. And Al-Nahda was the first party to agree with this. It was the first party to agree, and the party most against it, the PSP, whose Secretary General is a feminist, and she's totally a modernist, but both of them have had to adjust because they're playing politics. I mean, in a good sense. They're playing democratic politics. Al-Nahda says, look, if we accept this, people will begin to understand that we're not going to totally destruct the gains for women that have been made in the past. Even though always Bourguiba and Ben Ali always said, look, don't you ever think, we're giving you these rights, but don't you ever think that if we open up the system and have a free election, these rights will endure. They will just get eliminated. So that's the creation of a constituency for non-democracy, or even for coercion, that has to be eroded. And it's partly being eroded by the fact that Al-Nahda said, because when they have 30,000 people in jail, who ran the party? Especially in the rural areas. Whereas the secularist party, who are really totally in the French tradition. So basically, I'm talking of a triangle. 1905 France, Turkey, and Tunisia. They're in the hard secularism triangle, and Tunisia is going to get out of it. And I think, I mean, so the other thing they're going to try to, they accepted this, and then the reason why the secularist party, led by a feminist Secretary General, was anxious about this, because she knew they were so secularist that they were urban-based, middle-class based, and we're going to have great difficulties having 50% of the candidates. So both adjusted to each other, and then I think there's elements of what I call the twin toleration that are beginning to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Stephan for his intervention. He addressed the question of religion and democracy, Islam and democracy, Muslims and democracy, and how Muslims relate to the state and democratic systems. They relate differently in Turkey and in other countries. He pointed this out very well, and he compared Turkey to France, to the French secularism, and then he addressed the Tunisian example, and he focused on the process, the polarized political scene in Tunisia, the commitments of the Islamist Party in Tunisia, and finally the sequence of the transition in Tunisia. I take out from what you have said that in fact there is no one single model of relations of Muslims to democracy, and that democracy is very possible in Muslim minority and in Muslim majority countries. Now we have a prominent sociologist in David Stark. David is a sociologist who was very interested, also is very interested in democratization processes. He's the chair of the Department of Sociology, also at Columbia University, with Laszlo Proust, who was on the first panel. They published Pathways from State Socialism, published by Cambridge University Press, and his most recent books has a title which is a little bit musical, Sense of Dissonance. Sense of Dissonance, probably you will have the opportunity of giving us a slight idea about what it is. Probably it also relates to your intervention. The intervention by David Stark has as a title, Democratic Consolidation and Economic Transformation, Post-Socialist Experiences.
Thank you,
David,
Ibrahim.
15 minutes,
Thank
please.
you. Thank you, Ibrahim, and thanks also to Lisa Anderson for this invitation. I can't think of any university that I'd more like to be in than the American University in Cairo, in this very exciting city at this moment. I want to acknowledge first that the ideas that I'll be presenting today were developed in collaboration with my two co-authors, Laszlo Brust and Balázs Bedres. Now I have a lot to do. I want to introduce some ideas. I want to present some data. I want to interpret some findings. So let me get right started. My task is first to talk with you about the specificity of the post-socialist transformations. And by post-socialists, I'll refer to those cases of the former Soviet Union, those countries, and East Central Europe. I see the specificity of the post-socialist transformation in this following way. Here's the post-socialist challenge. Can property regimes be successfully transformed while citizenship rights are simultaneously, and I have to emphasize it's the simultaneity of these transformations, while citizenship rights are extended to the propertyless? So we can talk about this in slightly the same way. The challenge is how to transform property rights when the losers of economic reform, or we might specify that better, than those who do benefit least from those reforms, have political rights to replace political incumbents. Now, I'll say that is a specification, and I will make some modifications and elaborations on that. My question to you, Egyptians, would be that I would be very interested in hearing how you would specify, not in these same terms, but in perhaps as succinct terms, what is distinctive about the Egyptian transformation. Now, if we think about this challenge, the challenge is how to change property rights while the propertyless have the rights to replace political incumbents. Some concluded that there was a false choice. These post-socialist cases they would really either be able to choose democratization or economic reform, but not both. That was impossible, because if you would have economic reform, the losers would vote it down and you would undo it. And if you choose economic reform without democratization, you might get economic reform, but not democratization. If you have democratization, you can't have economic reform, because those who benefit least will vote those incumbents out of office and undo economic reforms. The lesson of these countries has been that this is a false choice, as it was also a false choice that nations had to choose, these countries and societies had to choose between strong states and strong markets. The lessons of these cases across them, both those that succeed and the lessons of those that fail, is that democratization led to stronger states, and that these stronger states were the ones that were able to produce economic reforms. States that seemed to be strong because there were strong men, because there was the single and decisive seat of power, we might have thought that those so-called strong states would have been able to launch and carry through ambitious programs of economic reform. That's not the case. Strength, in the sense of being very powerful and unchecked, did not lead to higher state capacity to bring about economic reform. There are a wonderful set of paradoxes in these cases. One of them is that constraints on power made states stronger and more capable to carry out economic reforms. because they were checked by horizontal accountabilities, which I'll talk about, meant that they had to produce programs that appealed to greater numbers of constituencies and increased their opportunities and chances for being successful. And I talked about the post-socialist challenge. My theme is how to incorporate the losers. The post-socialist surprise was that it turned out that the main obstacles to democratization and to economic development were not posed by the losers, were not posed by those who didn't gain or who gained the least from economic reforms, but were posed by the early winners. That is, in cases where there was not constraints on national authorities, in which political power was not unchecked, the early winners of the process of economic reform were able to say, oh, well, I won something. You know what? I will be able to seize also political power, because it's not so difficult to do, and it is very centralized, and the more centralized and unchecked it is, the more I get. So why don't I just continue to be the winner? And so let's stack the political rules in favor of me continuing to be the winner. So it wasn't the losers that were the opponents of continued economic reform, that is, real reform that would bring about dynamic and vital economies, but the early winners of those reforms, of those changes that were, the economic changes that were brought about. So the question is, now, we can specify this challenge more. It is both how to incorporate the losers, but also how to tame the winners. I said that democratization allows you to do that, and the failing to democratize is an obstacle to handling these challenges. But what do I mean by democracy? One of the ways of thinking about democracy is that there's vertical accountability. The elected are accountable to those who elect them. But there's another way we can think about democratization, and that is about a horizontal accountability. The idea is Guillermo O'Donnell's, and Laszlo Brust and I take this idea and think about extended accountability. Extended accountability, first of all, involves horizontal accountability, because there are governmental units that must give an accounting to other governmental units by sort of different principles of legitimation. So there is a horizontal democratization when the principle of Al's unit and the principle of Ibrahim's and the principle of mine are different, and we must give accounting to each other. And these checks make it possible, these checks and balances, make it less likely that really stupid mistakes get made. And they make it more likely that when they have been made, maybe not such stupid ones, that they can be corrected. So this is a horizontal accountability. It's necessary also, as well as the delegative accountability of vertical ties. We also refer to an extended accountability, because accountability is not only to one's narrow constituencies in terms of the relationship to the elected, but much broader types of constituencies, and especially to organized groups and actors in civil society. So it is an extended accountability to broader constituencies and a horizontal accountability. And it is this that allows elected officials and judiciaries and security forces to come to arrangements that check and balance each other and tame the winners. There's yet a third challenge, and that is to integrate the business networks. And why do I say the business networks? It turns out that in the period of high political uncertainty, there's also considerable uncertainty about the rules of the game in economics. So in the economy, when the institutions of the economy are uncertain, and even if ones have been announced, then there's uncertainty about enforcement, and you have regulations and policies. So until some kind of moment of institutional stability comes, many actors in the economy face such situation of uncertainty. Now what happens is that actors begin to hedge. They engage in something I call recombinant property. They hedge, they attempt to hold assets that can be viewed as valuable by more than one principle. Laszlo mentioned the notion of a poker game. I'm playing poker, I have a set of cards, but I don't know exactly, well, what kind of poker are we playing here? Or is it maybe that we're playing bridge or pinochle or some game? I don't know exactly what the game is, and so I would like my cards to be counted in as many possible games as possible. And some of us are actually wanting to keep multiple games going on at the same time, and we are hedging. And the result are forms of recombinant property. We might think about them as both public and private, or neither public nor private, but they are the result of this hedging. And in Hungary, one expression of that form, of those forms of recombinant property, this hedging, is the proliferation of intercorporate ownership networks. That is, that my firm and Al's firm may invest in each other. Or Al might invest in mine, I invest in Ibrahim, in Terry Carl's, and Terry's also in Philippe's, and so on, and we create these networks. Like actors who are assaulting a treacherous space as mountain climbers, groups make these interorganizational ownership ties to reduce the risk, to spread risk. You know, if I'm assaulting a treacherous space and I do it individually, I might be able to go up a lot faster. But I'm actually also concerned that I don't fall, and so I might bind myself to slow down the action but reduce the chances that I'll fall. So business networks are a means to spread risk. They can be shady. But they can also be assets and not shady when they are brought from the shadows into the light of political day. So rather than just sort of not talking about them, not dealing with them, the question is, how can they be used as an opportunity in the development process? This is to we turn. Because there's yet one fourth challenge. And that is how to domesticate foreign capital. Because in these cases, unlike, as I understand, the Egyptian, many of these countries had enormous foreign debt. The foreign debt of Hungary was equal to the entire valuation of the assets of the entire society. So there were ideas like, if we could just sell the entire country, then we would be able to change our capital debt course, because nobody wants to do that. But there are also important benefits of bringing in and attracting foreign capital. It brings in new technologies, access to markets, and so on. But while at the same time one wants this capital, one would not want to be in a situation in which one is integrated into the world market solely on that basis in ways that are out of control. So the challenge additionally is how to domesticate foreign capital. And since I have 5 minutes more, I can present some findings of data that we collected in Hungary. This is just the sort of tip of the iceberg of 3 or 4 papers that utilize these data. So my question is,